So welcome to Cutting Edge December 2020, and in this episode we're going to be talking about attributes of cognitive functions, updated attributes of cognitive functions. Cutting Edge with CSJ, December. Now it's been a while since I've even talked about cognitive functions individually. I know that, in season 18, I've been talking about like the updated definitions of cognitive functions, but for this, we're going to be doing something a little bit different with cognitive functions. Okay, and this is in a box, and then this is in a box. Yep, they're all in a box. So cognitive functions, we got a lot of different aspects to cover. But the first things first is we're going to put in a nice little divide right down here. This little divider. Awesome. And then we're going to put in another divider. That way we can organize this information because we have a lots of information to cover. So, all right. So on this side, we're going to talk a little bit about gender. But these four functions represent the masculine functions, also known as the dominating functions. And then down here, these are the feminine functions. They're also submissive. Submissive functions. Now, remember, we're looking at this from an individual standpoint of individual functions themselves. We're going to talk about how this translates a little bit into the type grid after the fact. So bear with me because a lot of you are going to be like, well, wait a minute, how does this even work? Now, let's talk about masculine versus feminine functions and dominating versus submissive functions. So individually, if you notice something about the top four functions, those are Templar. Those are Templar functions, and then below you have philosopher functions. So what this represents is that this model, if you're paying a lot of attention to it, you'll see an interesting pattern is forming basically. So, and what this pattern basically is, especially if you want to use these in here, but this is basically a DNA pair strand essentially. That represents, the cognitive functions themselves. So right here, and then furthermore, if you want to even go further, you have water, you have earth, you have wind, and you have fire, also known as the sun, basically, at the top. And then you have logos, you have ethos, and then you have, although ethos you could kind of, I don't know, like it's hard to, I could argue TE or FI is ethos, like realistically. If I remember correctly though, ethos is actually more principle focused, so ethos is more FI. And the TE one is this one, datos or data, and then pathos is right here, basically. So this shows you like so like whatever the Greek word is for data, datos, I think is what it is. Correct me if I'm wrong. Someone go look it up. I wouldn't mind help with that. So we have the four elements, and then you have the four areas of decision making. So over here we'll use this. So you have elements are also equivalent to perception, and then you have uh, like the Greek decisions basically. So you have decision making. Decisions equals judging or how to judge things, etc. And what this basically looks like is a DNA pair strand. This is the base template right here, the complete base template of our souls. This is the cognitive functions represented directly within the context of our DNA. And I had a really hard time with this because I had to do some math with it, but I realized that this is the only way to logically lay it out in a way where it makes sense because um, water is always at the bottom. It's also the most chaotic element. It's also very simple. So Ne goes at the very bottom of the order. If you think about it, when you're talking about like things physical here on the Earth, water is always on the ground. It's always the lowest you can go, trying to get to sea level. The Earth actually stands above water because obviously you have mountains, etc. So from a physical standpoint, it's important. And above the Earth, you have the sky where the wind is. That's the SE basically. And above the sky and above the wind, at the very highest point, you have the sun burning, providing heat, and heat rises towards the sun basically. And that gives you, your Ni. So obviously Ni is the top. And if you notice each of them, in terms of the order of the elements, you start to notice how their cognitive axes are directly attached. Because when you're looking at water right here, it goes over to Earth, etc., and that is a cognitive axis. No different with extroverted sensing, with introverted intuition. It's also cognitive axis. Now, I knew that this was true for the basic template of a DNA pair strand, but the problem is that how did I order the decision making functions, because I knew that everything was following the with nature basically. Nature itself is following the order of the cognitive axes themselves basically, as a result, which is important. And by the way, the red part I would like to state here, which it's not really well representative. This is cognitive orbit, and I suspect we'll be discussing this DNA pair strand next month in January 2020 to go over the cognitive orbit half of this model, but I wanted to focus on the axes initially. So daturen. So neuter, past participle of do, to give, doublet of date, datum. Okay, but what is the verb in Greek that is to collect data or to data, or like what's the data version of it? Because all of those are verbs: pathos, logos, ethos, basically. Dados seems to be, yeah, that's true. Do you like Dados? Yeah, it does. So I guess, I mean, it is still in the Romantic language area with a Latin root word, of course. So it's possible that I am correct in saying it's Dados for the TE aspect. But the red part of the strand represents cognitive orbit. I'm not ready to talk about that today. We'll talk about that later. I really want to kind of just dive into the axes a little bit and show you these different components. And there's so much here. There's like so much, and I got really fucking deep with it. So we're gonna look at how deep the rabbit hole goes. Graphos, it might be Graphos. I'm not sure though, but literally it is specifically to collect and to show data. Find me that verb. That Greek verb, that is the word. Ancient Greek word. So now there's always a lot of things missing. So like for example, and I just want to just throw this out there. It's kind of a tangent, but let's consider the zodiac for a second. The zodiac, I personally believe that there is definitely something to the zodiac. I'm also a huge fan of Battlestar Galactica, which is all about the zodiac. And the problem is that there is a big issue with the zodiac. The zodiac also has an attachment to it called the cards of life, with the 52 cards. etc., which is a fantastic representation of the zodiac. You can check that out at thecardsoflife.com. I highly recommend it. I'm a 5 of spades. It matches my personality exactly as is, like literally exactly. So check that out. But 12 signs of the zodiac, I realized that based on all of the mathematics that I've been doing, I think the zodiac is actually pretty accurate. The problem is that the zodiac is incomplete because it's missing 4 signs. Uh, it's missing constellations because the zodiac thinks that it's doing all of its calculations based on like a base 3 approach, when the reality is we know that because the 4 sides of the mind, the human soul and the human experience is actually base 4. So if you're going to look at this from a calculus point of view, you have to really consider that. And I would like to say, shout out to Kazmodo for actually kind of mathematically modeling this, from a lambda calculus point of view, which I really appreciate. So shout out to Mr. Kaz if you ever watch this. I appreciate you showing me some of your mathematical models that you've been using on the whiteboard that help me reach this line of logic. But the point is that my theory is with the zodiac right now is that the zodiac is incomplete. It's missing 4 signs. Right now, if we look at the zodiac, we can see the starters, we can see the finishers, and we can see the structure types, but we're not even able to see the background types. We can't even see them, which is also conducive to the churchianity point of view with the biblical Trinity. I remember my ESTP mentor trying to teach me that the Trinity exists within the types, and he said, the structure types, that's God the Father. The starter type is God the Holy Spirit. The finisher types, or he'd call the chart the course types using the Linda Barron's model, that's Jesus, the Son of God, etc. But I'm like, well, what about the background types? And the aspect of the Trinity is assuming the base 3 approach of the human soul. And I was reading this book called Sapiens recently, and in Sapiens, I realized that when the author was explaining the discovery of numbers in archaic sapiens, archaic sapien culture, sometimes they would actually have multiple mathematical systems simultaneously. They would have base 6, which is basically imperial, and then they have base 10, which is metric, right? And oftentimes, people, when they're trying to like understand the zodiac, they use base 3 mathematics, and to understand just human beings, especially from the perspective of gender, they would use base 2. The problem is that all of that is inaccurate. It's completely inaccurate. And this book, Sapiens, really showed me how in archaic or ancient cultures, like we're talking like in the days of Mesopotamia, the days of Babylon, etc., those days, they would actually, the Incan Empire, like really, really ancient cultures that really utilize mathematics and for numbers, etc. And they'd have to use numbers because they were trying to figure out how to tax people who would participate in cities, because as soon as a human being gets to a point where within their band or their crew or their family or their tribe, the mind can only handle about 150 people, 150 relationships at one time. Otherwise, before it just becomes a problem, and then eventually some groups split off and create new bands, etc. But in order for you to have a society of thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people, the only way to actually manage that society is to have an accounting of numbers. Utilize numbers to obviously collect taxes, to keep order and fund certain things, and understand how the society goes, right? And I actually think Carl Jung spoke about this a little bit in one of his books, but I don't know. But one such culture, and I believe it was in the time of Hammurabi in Mesopotamia, they used both base 6 and base 10 mathematics simultaneously. They used them simultaneously. And they had different uses for base 6 and base 10 math. Now, when you're looking at a human being, we assume it's base 2 because you have male and female, etc. But the reality situation is we're base 4. We're base 4 because we have the 4 sides of the mind. And if you then take that and compare that to the information that I present within season 17, when I talk about season 17, episode 1, which is the source of all cognition, and I make the argument for the existence of God, basically, I'm throwing out my ESTP mentor's theory of base 3 and assuming a Trinitarian approach. I do not maintain that God would have a trinity. I maintain that he would have four sides just like we have four sides. That base 4 would kind of explain, God the Creator's cognition. And if we are created in the image of God, then we would definitely have to be base 4 just like God is. And if that's the case, that means then the background types would also have to be representative, logically speaking, within the zodiac itself. Now, this is where people are starting to freak out and be like, okay, well, wait a minute. But the thing is, folks, is that the universe is far more symmetrical than you realize. It's also far more deterministic than you realize. And a lot of people who are NI users out there and SE users out there would completely disagree with me on that because, well, my freedom. Because then they're asking, like, well, then you're saying, Chase, that there's no such thing as free will. And I'm like, actually, there is a such thing as free will. But it's free will within a box. You could do whatever you want, but within these boundaries. And those boundaries are bound by introverted sensing, extrovert intuition, access. Those boundaries within this, within those metaphysical aspect then. So General Kenobi, while I am not a Trinitarian, I do maintain that they definitely exist. But I also maintain that they're separate entities entirely. I do not maintain that they are the same entity. Unless, of course, there is a fourth side to it, and then I could claim it's the same entity. Sure. So all I'm saying is that both theories are plausible, but I'm not going to deny either one. But I'm going to say that the standard narrative of Trinitarian doctrine in terms of explaining the Godhead, according to the churchianity Christians out there, I think it's fundamentally false. No, not necessarily, because Satan doesn't understand the power of God whatsoever, because Satan rebelled against God because no one actually knew. They were ignorant of how powerful God actually was. So Satan is an entirely different entity with his own base 4 approach. But then again, remember, the angels were made out of fire and wind, which is interesting if you look at this model. They're made of fire and wind, which is that they're at the top of this. And we were made out of earth and water, which is the bottom. Think about that. Think about that. It's pretty fucking crazy if you think about it as we delve into these metaphysics right now. This is probably going to be one of the most metaphysical episodes I ever do. But anyway, in order for us to understand this genome properly, this psychological genome, I need to be able to present to you the metaphysical side first as an establishment. So again, back to the zodiac. The zodiac then, therefore, I think the zodiac is very accurate. The problem is that we can only see 12 constellations, and we see that they have relationships. And if you actually look at the zodiac calendar, and it's gotten to the point where the zodiac has so degraded over time. It has so degraded over time that people haven't even realized that their calendar is completely and totally screwed. You have the old calendar, which is what people typically use, and you have the new calendar. And both calendars, like, there's certain signs that if you're only born within a period of 2 to 3 weeks, then you're that sign, because they're trying to compensate for the fact that there's a missing 4 signs. Why is there missing 4 signs? All right, here's the best example I could show you. This is a pen. You see the pen, and you're looking at this pen, and you can see it this way, right? What happens when I turn the pen this way? Well, it just looks like a little circle with a bump on it at this point. You see what I'm saying? Now, if you're looking out with your telescope from the Earth and trying to find these constellations, what about the constellation that the Earth is inside? What about the constellations that are adjacent to the Earth? But because they are so close, we can't see their pattern. You see what I'm saying? Based on our position within the Milky Way galaxy. And people are like, oh, Mr. C.S. Joseph, that's not a thing. There are other things that could also be hidden from our sight. It's like having a blind spot right? When you're driving a car, you have a blind spot. I'm saying that those of us on the Earth, while we have 360-degree vision potentially from the Earth, based on the Earth's position within the Milky Way galaxy and how everything is moving within its orbit, within and without the Milky Way galaxy, etc., that doesn't mean that there couldn't be a blind spot. And I'm saying a blind spot could exist. So based on that, this is why my argument exists that there are 4 signs missing from the zodiac, just like we have 4 types missing from the Trinitarian doctrine point of view in terms of, God's cognition and the source of cognition, etc. Right? So, um, okay, yes, I understand that Polaris, has been known to move, etc., and it has some variability, but it's still in that same position over time. And there was also there's a guy who did a documentary on this a while back. I forget what it's called. I think his documentary is called The Star of David, where he actually proves the existence of the Star of David because he took an AI system who has all of the star calendar completely tracked on any position of the Earth. You could tell his AI system to simulate the Earth, simulate a certain date, etc., and he could literally go back in time and see, and look in the sky at certain dates, etc., and look at what the sky looked at certain dates. And he actually found the Star of David going back in the past. And the Star of David is not the Star of David. So the Star of David, the symbol for the Star of David, it's actually a triangle on top of another triangle. And the Star of David is actually technically 2 stars. 2 stars on top of each other in a star alignment, making it look like a megastar because they're like right on top of each other and they're in a certain position with the space and giving off the same light. It's pretty fantastic. Yes, Zodiac is based off of birth date, Mr. Kenobi, but the thing is with the Zodiac is that the calendar is inaccurate. If we had the 4 other signs and could observe the other constellations, we could in fact be able to see what those constellations are. I mean, that's very important to understand and realize, as a result. Yes. The North Star does drift a little, and as it moves, I've seen some things saying that Polaris is the same thing, and some people make the argument that Polaris doesn't change. But according to that documentary, Polaris didn't change. However, its position does change a little bit, but it's still in the area of the north. But it's very small variability, a very, very small variability. And I believe it's always lined up with the Big Dipper, for example, etc. You could maybe even argue that the Big Dipper or some of the other constellations, etc., that are not part of the Zodiac actually are part of the Zodiac, etc. But I don't know enough about the Zodiac to really say that per se. I'd have to care enough to study about it. I'm just not. The point is that my theory is that these things are just not there. Why is this relevant when talking about a psychological genome and attributes of cognitive functions? Let me put a dash here. We're talking about the psychological genome. Okay. So you're saying that theoretically, if we had a calendar based around 16 months, it would be more accurate? Yes. Yes. Using base 4 instead of base 12. Yes. That's what I'm saying. That's exactly what I'm saying, Kenobi. So anyway, you can actually calculate it out a little bit more, but yeah, using different calendars, you could actually come up with something a little bit more accurate. But so anyway, let's go back to this cognitive psychological genome here. When you have this double helix set up and you have the cognitive axes represented, you have cognitive orbit represented, what can you do with it? Well, imagine you're holding it in your hands like so, and you could fold it together. You could fold it one way, you could fold it the opposite direction, you could twist it, and you could twist it in different ways. You could do a twist and fold and twist and fold, twist and fold. There are so many different combinations that you could actually utilize this basic genome pattern right here, and you could basically get certain functions to touch other functions, which interestingly enough ends up creating an ego. And so the order of the functions that I have here represents a psychological template for our souls. This is a template, okay? Template, all right? And how it's folded or how it's twisted, how it's used basically, it literally represent it. You literally could just off of this template create an ego. Okay. Well, the thing is that when you create an ego off of this, you have to understand that there are, let's put it over here, there are primary, uh, or actually no, let's not do it that way. Let me use a better terminology for it. Um, uh, um, so let me do it properly. So we're talking about dominant. So when an ego is created, you have dominant versus recessive functions. Dominant versus recessive functions. Okay, and this is what ends up giving you, for example, hero slash child, right? And then you have parent slash inferior, basically, all in yin and yang equilibrium, as a result. So this gives you the ability to literally understand, that because of this template, this literally shows you how the cognitive functions are effectively, and while this is a theory, I'll admit, it shows you effectively how the cognitive functions are actually stored in our genome, in our DNA, basically. Because you end up having dominant and recessive alleles within your DNA. You end up having dominant versus recessive alleles within dominant recessive functions, and that's where you get the cognitive attitudes. The cognitive attitudes are completely based on this model. This is why I could add aspects of masculine and feminine areas, masculine and feminine areas, etc., within this genome, etc., to that end. And some people have higher dominance and some people do not. Some people are more submissive, etc. But here's the thing, like, you could be like, well, Mr. C.S. Joseph, I see at the bottom that you have philosopher functions and at the top you have Templar functions. Again, this is just a template. Well, Mr. C.S. Joseph, you say that the ISFJ is the most feminine of all the types. Yes, it absolutely is. When you look at how you use this template, I mean, this template could be a template of a bunch of heroes. I mean, because look, this genetic template right here, it's so basic, it actually has a lot more to go along with it. Because this could be a template of the hero functions. Then you have to add in the template of the parent functions, the child functions, the inferior functions, all the way down to the demon functions. And then you have to actually multiply that base 2 by their mature forms, which is warrior, warrior parent, divine child, noble, ally, grandparent, master, angel, etc., right? So it becomes an extremely complex genome with, dominant recessive alleles and, various different ways of doing it. But I just am trying to present the simplest aspect that I possibly can, with this without actually touching on cognitive orbit, because that just makes it crazier. Um, so, okay. So anyway, it's just something for you to keep. So Yeah, I agree with you, Kaz. I agree. But I mean, dados is the Spanish word. You missed that discussion towards the beginning of this presentation. But yes, I think kairos is probably a bit more accurate. So I'll just go ahead and add it in for right now for the TE side of it. So we'll just put that in right now. Okay, cool. So anyway, uh, and like I said, when coming up with a specific genetic template, the psychological genome is that when you're considering the cognitive axes, which is the green side here of this helix, you end up having TEFI as an axis basically represent at the beginning because it's more of the feminine, it's more of the submissive. It's because it's subjective. It's far more subjective. Now, granted, you have, the subjective functions are represented on the right side here, and the objective functions are represented on the or on the left here, on the right, and this is the left. Excuse me, I got that backwards. So I'll just add that in here. We have subjective going from the top, and that represents this row here or column. And then we have the objective functions, which is really interesting if you think about it, going down here. And while SI and FI, and if you're to compare individual functions, their objectives, NI is definitely more objective than SI is, and TI is more objective than FI is, which is why those two functions are technically more masculine. They carry more masculine traits, whereas FI and SI carry more feminine traits, basically, as a result. So propitious moment for decision or action. Yeah, that's probably not going to work. Dados is probably best. So I don't know, because again, TE is all about trying to come up with a collection of data over time. So we'll see if that is. So thank you, Buga, for verifying that. Let's just stick with dados for now until we can find the actual verb, the actual Greek verb to use, because I didn't really research that well enough for the sake of this presentation. So anyway, so you have subjective and you have objective functions going down in those two columns, etc. And then you have the masculine and dominating functions versus the feminine and submissive functions after that. And then it gets even more crazy. While we have subjective and objective functions, guess what? Objective functions also are the producing functions. They produce. And then subjective functions are also the consuming functions. They consume. Consuming. And as Kaz told me earlier today, exothermic versus endothermic, which was excellent as well. Thank you for bringing that up. I really appreciated getting that kind of perspective, because the cognitive functions definitely represent those differences for sure, if you're going to break it down here, although it has a different keel when you're considering translating this directly into the type grid. Because like I said, guys, while the cognitive functions have each of their own little mini attributes themselves, they have their own attributes themselves, which is important. Those attributes change because it's like, well, they have really masculine functions here, but but Chase, TI child is a masculine function, etc. And you have FE parents, and you're telling me that why aren't they half masculine, half feminine for an ISFJ, and the ISFJ is the most feminine of the types, regardless of gender. And it's like, well, again, it's because when you're creating an ego using this psychological genome template, you have to follow dominant versus recessive functions, dominant versus recessive alleles, which translate directly into cognitive attitudes. Now, obviously, it would be static. It would not be dynamic. It would be static if every single function was a hero function within this genetic selection, within this collection, sure. But it's not It's not, you know. So, and yes, that's accurate, Cynthia. Yes, they will change in appearance. So, and that's kind of my main point. You know, uh, the Earth is in a blind spot to not see the background signs. Essentially, it's not able to see them. So, so with that going on, there's also sending versus receiving, consuming and producing. I like saying consuming versus producing functions. I think that's better. There's also unconscious versus conscious functions, and that's also very important too. So I'm going to add that up here. Unconscious functions on this column, which is important because, like I've said before, I've basically stated that the subjective functions, the SE functions, don't actually exist. That's why they're kind of technically fictitious. They are fiction. So over here, this is conscious on this side as well, but they are also nonfiction, right? Uh, to a point, they're really nonfiction. And why is this necessary? In reading the book *Sapiens* recently, there was a passage within the book that explains how the Neanderthals were wiped out by *Sapiens*. Neanderthals were harder, better, faster, stronger. They were much stronger than *Sapiens*, and in a one-to-one bout, the Neanderthal would absolutely kill the *Sapien* every single time. The problem is that Neanderthals were a collective, a race or species of sensors. Those sensors completely lacked intuition. It's because they didn't have fiction. There's no fiction in Neanderthal culture. There was no fiction in it. Instead, they were literally just non-fiction, concrete sensing people. Sapiens, however, did have fiction. And because they had fiction, that gave them an intuitive advantage to allow them to strategize ways to beat Neanderthals, and they annihilated the Neanderthals. Um, so, based on that, it's the same kind of thing here. Um, you know, the objective functions, and Neanderthals are super objective, but because of Sapiens' ability to get into the subjective and utilize that subjectivity really allowed them to be able to come up with strategies and better ways of doing things in order to conquer the threat of Neanderthals. And that's why the Neanderthals were ultimately wiped out. It's because of that main cognitive difference. Fiction is just as important as nonfiction. But without fiction, we would not be able to achieve what we are able to do today because, like, the US dollar is a fiction. A business or a corporation is a fiction. An economy is a fiction, right? So that's where it comes from. It's super important. Uh, so, and then obviously you have external versus internal functions, which adding additional attributes up here. This side are the external functions. We're just going to keep adding to this huge ass list. And these are the internal functions. Also, reason why they are conscious functions versus unconscious functions. That's another aspect of looking at it. And but then dominant functions versus submissive functions, you have to go the horizontal direction instead of just the vertical. And then to go even worse than that, we've looked at I'm just going to list things down here. There's an argument to be made about which functions are exothermic versus endothermic. Thank you, Mr. Kaz, for bringing that up to me earlier today. That was excellent. But then to go even further, you have to consider positive versus negative charge as well. If human beings, our souls are basically electrical systems, which they are. They're electrical systems, our nervous system, our brain, it's a complete total electrical system, which means certain functions have positive and negative charge. And we know this is true when we're looking at pessimistic functions versus optimistic functions. But that doesn't come until after an ego is created and its attitudes are understood. So there's a little bit of a quantum leap there in terms of being able to understand the relationship between the positive and negative side, which it's able to do though. But because we have this basic template here for the psychological genome. This template can be applied at every single level of cognitive attitude, hero all the way down to demon, as well as warrior all the way down to angel, which you have their, their shadow side and their awakened side, basically, all the way down that genome, essentially. And then it's all, put together in this Ouroboros, area of DNA going in every direction, basically. And then as a result of that, you could twist it, you could fold it, etc., in 16 different combinations, and literally create and manufacture egos right off the bat with this psychological genome. My theory is that within our actual DNA, our physical DNA, this psychological genome in this template basically is embedded within our DNA. I really, really think so. I think it is embedded, and it's embedded with whatever combination is chosen, between whatever chromosomes, etc., put together and whatnot. So, uh, so yeah. Well, no, that doesn't mean we incorporated them, Cynthia. We wiped them out. It's just that, there was inbreeding between the different races. Just like you have different subspecies, or you have different hybrids, etc., right? Different there's hybrids. Like you have a mule, for example, um, or if you mule and a horse, then it equals a donkey. You see what I'm saying? Like there's different ways of doing things, not entirely doing all of it, etc. Um, so yeah, and again, by the way, with the psychological genome template, cognitive orbit still represents an entire aspect of the genome itself. You could almost argue that cognitive orbit represents the epigenetic side of this psychological genome, basically. It's the epigenome, which is also on the other side within this basic template, etc. Um, so it would make a lot of sense, in that aspect, from that point of view. Do I have any other aspects too? Yes, I do actually. I forgot to say there's another level in here. And which color have I used the least? I've used blue the least. Okay. So I'm going to put this here. I'm going to say sexual, and then I'm going to say sexual down here, and then I'm going to say, let's see here. I'm going to say emotional, emotional, emotional. Okay. And why is this important? That's because these functions here are emotional. Uh, these functions here are emotional. These functions are sexual, right? Okay. So you can also see how sexuality is actually like playing out here within this genome as well. You could see where a person's emotions exist. It goes alongside their decision making. So someone wielding logos and pathos, that's how their emotional makeup is. And, they have wind and fire for their sexual makeup simultaneously. And it's all represented directly here within our genome, all these things. Um, so genetic attachment to functions is an interesting hypothesis, but it conflicts with what you said about types not running in families. No, it's because types run within our race, not within families. Seriously, Kenobi, or no, Cynthia Payne, you have to understand something. The nuclear family and monogamy is an extremely new idea. You have people out there who claim that there was the nuclear family and monogamy within humanity like long, long time ago. And it's just not true. It's just not true at all. The actual real genetic standard, I was actually watching a woman complain on a live stream earlier on Facebook, or no, maybe it was like a little video, I don't remember. But she's like, why do men get to go have sex with anyone they want and there's no repercussions for them and they can have sex with as many women as possible, but women, however, get trashed on, if they have sex with more than with just as many people as men do. And the guy's response to that was evolution. Yeah, it's literally evolution. That is the reason. It's evolution. Because if you think about it, like in ancient times, there was no such thing as there's no such thing as monogamy. There is no such thing as any of this. I mean, let's look at biology, because a woman a woman biologically will put her children above her man. She's supposed to do that. Uh, and if a child sleeps with a man in the same room, his testosterone drops drops significantly. So if you're a father and you just had a baby, you better not have that child like in the room that you're sleeping. Your testosterone will drop. And then your woman will lose respect for you on top of that because you're not performing as much as a man. That would be like one of the most horrible decisions that you could make. Don't do it. Okay. So you know, that's where that is. And the number one cause of men divorcing women is women putting their children above their men. So monogamy ends up forcing people to deny their own biology. Women have to deny their biology because they're not putting their children above they're not able to put their children above their man, basically, in a monogamous situation, which they're biologically supposed to. A man has to deny his biology because he's not able to have multiple sex partners at the same time, which a man would need in order to have his sexual needs met, because the women are in a different mode of being a mother, basically, and not a sexual partner, basically. So based on that, one woman, biologically speaking, cannot satisfy one man, biologically speaking. It just can't happen, So, and the reason why is because of children, and this is biologically proven. This is proven in books like Sex at Dawn. This is proven in books like Sapiens, etc. Check out these sources. It's a fact. It's also supported by additional research by Christopher Canwell, additional research by Rollo Tomasi as well. And there's also, gosh, what was that other book? There's another source on it, and I forgot what it was. But the bottom line is that this is reality. This is literally reality. And monogamy gets in the way of, this evolutionary process. But monogamy is necessary in order to keep the population down so the Malthusians get their way, So gotta let that happen. The people like Bill Gates, he's a Malthusian, if you want to know what a comparison is there. There's also additional attributes of cognitive functions here, because you can identify specific abstract versus concrete functions. You can identify systematic versus interest-based functions right away. Basically, any little component that you have on the type grid itself can actually be applied as individual attributes to the cognitive functions. They really can. The difference is that it doesn't carry over to an ego, because when an ego is built, then cognitive attitudes come into play with dominant and recessive functions, which is why just because you have you have a bunch of interest-based functions, the person ends up becoming systematic, but that systematic person ends up having two interest-based subconscious and unconscious. See, that's where those attributes actually played out. They're played out on the other four sides of the mind, essentially. So it's really, really important, to understand that. So again, this is a base template. You can apply every attribute within the type grid to individual functions, as well as all these attributes here on this whiteboard. It's all represented. The difference is that when you use this template to create an ego, well, you end up creating, due to dominant versus recessive functions, that law basically, it's a law of genetics with dominant and recessive alleles, etc. You end up creating dominant and recessive cognitive attitudes, which start off as immature, and they have to mature over time, from hero to warrior, for example, but they also have components of pessimism versus optimism that also have to, which each carry a positive and negative charge. Very, very important to know. I do actually kind of want to slightly talk about that just a little bit, so I'm going to do that below here. But let's use who should I pick on, huh? I've been picking on ISFJs, so I'll just keep picking on ISFJs. So let's see. So we have the four sides of the mind. You have an SI, FE, you have an SI, FE, TI, NE, SE, FI, TE, NI setup. Okay. And because this is an ego, it's a positive side of the mind, and then you have a negative side of the mind. Okay. So and then you also have a positive side of the mind, and you have a negative side of the mind. Okay, so positive, negative sides of the mind. Very important. But then you have little individual functions, and because this is a hero, it is optimistic. Because this is a parent, this is pessimistic. Then you have a child that is optimistic, and then you have an inferior, which is pessimistic. But then you have the same order here as well, right? The same order. However, you can reverse polarity here. You can reverse polarity. Why? Because guess what, folks? It leads to cognitive transition. Cognitive transition mechanically is literally you're reversing the polarity. This is cognitive transition. Remember, our souls are electrical systems. It's literally electricity. Cognitive transition. If you reverse the polarity here, this is where cognitive transition comes from. Okay? But check this. Okay? So you have here this here, this here, this here, this here, representing positive and negative energies within each of the four sides of the mind. So this ends up translating over here, which means the hero warrior is positive positive, but this is positive negative. This is positive positive, but this is positive negative. Over here, this ends up being negative positive, negative negative, negative positive, negative negative. And then again, you could still reverse the polarity specifically within within each of the within the others. So like Ni, Te, Fi, Se. So this is the reverse polarity, and then you just put in the same things in there. Plus, minus, and then you do minus, 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 minus as a result. And you can see how it's a reverse polarity, which is this is a superego transition as a result. Okay, so yes. Okay. So as you can see here within this model, you can see how cognitive transitions mechanically work because you're literally just reversing the polarity of your mind and able to, and depending on what side of the mind you're using, you can reverse that polarity. And if you combine this with the September 2020 cutting edge episode, you can combine that all the way across. You could see like how you could literally manufacture actual decisions based on combining cognitive functions together using this model, and you could literally do it through cognitive transition. The system is gigantic, and quite frankly, it's ultimately limitless, and we're constantly learning more and more new things about the human mind as we do this. But you literally could see using an energy system, an electrical energy system, how cognitive transition actually works. Because the four sides of the mind have their own positive or negative charge, but then also the cognitive functions have their own positive and negative charge. And then how does this model here translate to the overall psychological genome model and the psychological epigenome at the same time if we're actually doing cognitive orbit? at the same time, which I think I'll talk about in the January 2020, which would be like part 2 of this, etc. You can kind of see how that works. So anyway, this is, there's so many different ways to represent this, but you can literally kind of just see how important, how like this really supports the hypothesis that there is our brains definitely, and our cognition definitely follows the same genetic double helix pattern. It follows the same pattern. It's the same. So this represents the why, but we don't know the how. So we have to. So this is the NE, the why, but we need the SE. We need the how. We haven't got there yet, but we're getting there. But quite frankly, folks, this is literally nothing more than calculus. Literally calculus, and can be easily figured out with calculus. You just have to know all the vectors and process all the derivatives, and then you will literally understand how the entire human mind works. Very simply. And this is literally nothing more than a genetic computer. So simple. So anyway, it's absolutely fucking fantastic. It just blows me away, that we're able to get to this level and know these things. And don't forget, guys, with these attributes, you also can apply all of the type grid attributes. It's just you have to translate them to egos. You got to translate to egos, and egos, dominant versus recessive, and then you have the cognitive attitudes. Anyway, that completes this episode. Now it's time for Q&A. So if you have any Q&A relating to this particular presentation of Cutting Edge, now's the time. It was very metaphysical, so some people like it, some people don't. But kind of had to do it just so you guys can understand like the different aspects of it thereof. If someone can get me more information on Polaris moving, I'd appreciate that, because I was under the understanding, based on a book that I read and a documentary that I read, that Polaris, yes, it moves, but it always returns back to its original position. That Polaris is cyclical, basically, for my previous argument about the zodiac. It's all good, Cynthia. It's all good. You don't have to. I don't know. Did you guys have like a nice mind-blowing experience here, or did I just make your eyes glaze or something? Is that what happened? I don't really know. I think it would make a little bit more sense with cognitive orbit attached to it as well. So yeah. Anyway. All right. Yeah, and don't forget, guys, when you're looking at consuming versus producing functions, you have to remember that this is also like a radio transmission system, because this is ultimately an electrical. Because this is ultimately an electrical system, it's still a radio, and we're sending and receiving radio signals. Sending would be from introverted functions, receiving would be from extroverted functions that we're using to tune in. And we're basically sending and receiving energy to each other's cognitive functions, basically. And that's just really who we are. I mean, it's when you look at the concept of transference, like when doing massage, it's the same kind of concept, but we're able to engage it with all 5 of our senses and have this energy exchange. But then, like, you don't even have to be touching someone or interacting with someone, and there's still an energy exchange because of like body language, even. So yeah. Okay, so I have twins born on the same day with 2 very different personalities. How can a zodiac, no matter how accurate, account for that? Because you have to look at yin and yang equilibrium, Cynthia. For example, you look at the Dolan twins. One's an ESTP, one's an ENTP, yet they're both TI parent, right? There is always some kind of shared function or some kind of relationship between their functions. either from a camaraderie standpoint or from a compatibility standpoint, that is basically very much known, as a result. So, and yeah, but those secondary types are identified through cognitive focus. Like, I just type somebody, an ISTJ who's ENFP focused. That's just like a variant of the ISTJ thing. So yes, there are 64 total different types, but again, that's based on what's their cognitive focus. And some of those cognitive focuses are different, and some are more common than others. Okay, some of them are way more common than others. So secondary and tertiary. All right, cool. Thanks, Robert. Let's see here. Which is okay. Okay. I'll check that out. I really want to corroborate it with that Star of David guy. I'll probably send him an email because he made a huge deal out of that. But then again, his data was mostly from 2,000 years ago and not 4,800 years ago. So, in about 2,000 years, I wonder if that's true, but it probably is. But regardless, though, that doesn't change my argument either. I mean, it doesn't change my argument. Human beings probably haven't been around enough to actually and be recording the zodiac enough to be able to account for missing constellations. So, let's see here. Focus changes based on how strong each cognitive gateway. Yes, thicker cables. It's neural pathways. I've discussed this in earlier cutting edge episodes. It's neural pathways and developing neural pathways. And to get the fastest neural pathways in a child in terms of their development, you want to expose them to as many other psyches as possible to get like this little psychic radio going. With their polarity and their cognitive transitions and sending and receiving psychic energy consistently, as they're interacting with like all of the 16 types, basically with the entire type grid around them. If they're interacting constantly with one another, as a result, their neural pathways will develop faster. And this is how children, when they were teenagers, were basically able to think like adults in ancient times compared to today when they're not, because the nuclear family actually inhibits the intelligence of children, basically. Whereas in a multi-generational or poly family, they actually grow rapidly because they have so much available cognition with their family and their tribe that they're able to learn faster and reach manhood and womanhood a lot faster, and learn a lot faster. Collaboration is the key, and whereas there isn't really much, it's like a many-to-one relationship in a classroom when it should be a many-to-many relationship. A many-to-many relationship with child raising, child rearing, child bearing, etc. That many-to-many relationship helps them build the most neural pathways to help them have the healthiest mind they possibly could have, basically. So yeah, missing apostles. You could actually make the argument that that is John the Baptist, aka Elijah, Moses, etc. You know, other people from antiquity. You could make that argument. People from antiquity that were not considered prophets. Okay. I've seen Sword Art Online. You ain't getting me with that one. I know. I've seen Sword Art Online too, and I'm right there with you. Definitely. Yeah. Okay. No one trusts anything that makes humans actually equal because everyone fears the reality of inequality. Yeah. Well, there's also the reality of complementary, which is what it should be, but we don't really have that. And if you read Tomasi, you'll come to find out that that's the case, in that situation. So anyway, thank you all for the awesome questions. This was a really fun episode. I wasn't I regret not having cognitive orbit in here. The reason why is because there's a link between orbit and camaraderie, whereas axis is more related to synchronicity, aka compatibility. And honestly, that's so much to cover. That has to be like an episode in of its own right. So just bear with me on that. And I also regret that within this model, I don't have the entire, all of the attributes of the type grid also included with these individual functions as well. So I'm hoping to have that available in the next episode for January 2021. So that should work out just fine. Um, well, yeah, the Council of Nicaea did throw out a lot, but they also added a bunch of crap in too. So it's not exactly ideal. So anywho, folks, thanks for watching. Thanks for being here this month, and I look forward to speaking with you folks and seeing you guys next month. So with that being said, later.